We've got a lot of developments to get to with regard to Israel and especially with regards to the Biden administration's response to Israel. So let's put this first piece up on the screen. A report from Haaretz that the Biden administration is supposedly split on whether or not to suspend arms sales to Israel ahead of what they're describing as a deadline on Sunday. Now, that deadline has to do with this letter that the Biden administration was pressured into requiring Israel to sign, certifying that they are going to use these weapons and are using these weapons in accordance with international law, and that they are not blocking humanitarian aid. In other words, that it is actually legal for the U.S. to continue these arms sales, because to do so, if they are blocking humanitarian aid or if they are not, which we've all seen the reality of what's going on there, if they are not abiding by international law, that is illegal under our own laws. So they sent the letter from Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel. They sent the letter saying, yes, of course, we're following the laws, blah, blah, blah. And now the U.S. has to certify that that is the case. So let me read you a little bit of this report. They say that Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who is planning to visit Israel tomorrow, has until Sunday to approve Israel's stance. That stance was delivered earlier this week to the U.S. ambassador in Israel, Jack Lew, or the U.S. will immediately suspend weapons transfers to its close ally. We've already had some fallout around the world of other countries that have already suspended weapon shipments in different regards. So we had a group of Danish non-governmental organizations that said last week they would sue Denmark in a bid to end that country's arms exports to Israel. They cited concerns about crimes against Palestinian civilians. Last month, a Dutch court ordered the Netherlands to stop exporting parts for F-35 fighter jets to Israel, citing concerns the parts were being used to violate international law. Officials from 3 State Department bureaus, Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Population, Refugees and Migration, and the Office of Global Criminal Justice, as well as USAID, have all, according to this report, expressed deep skepticism about the idea that Israel is, in fact, in compliance. Israel's failure to allow a surge of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, they say, despite repeated commitments, remain a key driver of pessimism. And they also have an interesting quote here from Schumer that I wanted to take note of. In an interview with The Times, he added that without U.S. support, Israel's future could well be over, which I thought was kind of extraordinary, given, Schumer's overwhelming past commitment to the state of Israel. So, Saagar, I don't know if this is real, if there really is a schism here, if there really are people who are at a high level pushing for not certifying Israel's letter and commitment and actually suspending weapon sales. But if they did go in that direction, which, again, I will believe when I see, because we've seen the unconditional support that's been provided thus far, but if they did go in that direction, there's no doubt that would be quite significant.
I think what they would do, and this would be the smart play, is you would try to push for a ceasefire, and then you would do it post-ceasefire after they don't necessarily need it, perhaps as a pressure valve to try and say that you should not re-continue hostilities. There was an interesting quote you found, Krystal, in this Mother Jones piece. I was actually really struck by it. If we can put it up there on the screen. It was actually a quote from a retired Israeli Major General, Itzhak Brick, where he tells Mother Jones, quote, "All of our missiles, the ammunition, the precision-guided bombs, all the airplanes and bombs, it's all from the U.S. The minute they turn off the tap, you can't keep fighting. You have no capability." This is more significant than I had thought, because I had thought that the Israelis had more native capacity than I had understood. But what they lay out is that while the Israelis do have, let's say, artillery shells, unguided bombs and all of that, all of their precision munitions actually do come from the U.S., and that some of these dumb bombs, and quote unquote, largely their use has come either from running dry and not having yet been replenished by America. So I didn't realize that so much of the high-tech capacity of the IDF is actually backed by America. I knew it was some, and I knew it was significant, but I didn't think it was, quote, all of our missiles, all of the ammunition, all of the bombs, all of the airplanes is all from the U.S.
Yeah. And I mean, so the idea that, oh, we can't really do, Israel's a sovereign country, even if we did cut off weapons shipments, it wouldn't really make that big of a difference. That's just not true. And even if it were true, it still would behoove us to try to put pressure on Israel to end this absolute onslaught that has killed at least 30,000 Palestinians and has led to overwhelming levels of, imminent famine and actual deaths from starvation now in at least about 24 cases. And so that's what this administration is facing. They were sort of pressured by a group of senators into forcing Israel to issue this certification. And now, in the face of, we've been getting months reports about, potential levels of famine, potential levels of starvation, et cetera. We've just gotten a few more that have gone into specifics about the way that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. And we also have the images of young children and babies who are literally starving to death now. And we've, come to this point of pathetic desperation where the U.S. is now, airdropping in aid as if into some hostile territory rather than territory that is basically, completely run by our supposed ally, and floating this boondoggle port situation. More on that in a moment. But, it's come to the point where even Secretary of State Antony Blinken has to acknowledge the reality of the starvation that is unfolding on the ground. Take a listen to what he had to say recently.
According to the most respected measure of these things, 100% of the population in Gaza is at severe levels of acute food insecurity. That's the first time an entire population has been so classified. We also see, again, according to, in this case, the United Nations, 100%, the totality of the population is in need of humanitarian assistance.
So how, Saagar, do you say something like that? 100% of the population in Gaza is at severe levels of acute food insecurity. How can you possibly say and acknowledge that reality and then turn around and certify that, Israel is allowing humanitarian aid in and Israel's in compliance with our laws? They may well do it. Like I said, I'll believe it when I see it with regards to them taking any real action against Israel versus just these rhetorical shifts. But it seems to me that, it's very difficult to claim they're in compliance with our laws and deserving of these weapon sales when you have an entire population for the first time that is at severe levels of acute food insecurity and in certain instances actually starving to death.
Yeah, it was interesting that this happened in Canada. Let's go ahead and put this up there, please, on the screen, where they say that Canadians will actually be stopping arms sale. Well, at least consideration, this is from the foreign minister, after there was actually a non-binding motion that had passed through Parliament that called on them to do so. Very significant for a couple of reasons. Obviously, Canada is not Western European. Most importantly, though, it's a NATO member, somebody that, especially with the Trudeau administration, has cooperated pretty significantly with the Biden administration and does demonstrate as well kind of a split in the overall Western posture towards Israel. Even if there are some crazy anti-Semitism laws or whatever on the books in Europe, those governments are handling this very, very differently than we are.
Yeah, it is noteworthy, not because of the overall, amount of the arms sales coming from Canada. They're not that significant a player in that regard. But still, that such a close ally of ours would basically, look at this situation and say, we can't do this any longer. That is obviously noteworthy. So we'll see where that goes. I just also have to note that it's not like we've just stood by while Israel does these things. I mean, we have helped them with the starvation policy, in particular by, at their request, immediately defunding UNRWA, which is the #1 aid organization on the ground. And, we did that on the day that the ICJ ruling came down, acknowledging, it's plausible in South Africa as a decent enough case to continue this pursuit of whether or not Israel is, in fact, committing genocide. So we haven't just been observers here. We've been active participants in this horror that's unfolding of using starvation as a weapon of war, total collective punishment of the entire civilian population. And by the way, since that ICJ ruling came down, which did not call for a ceasefire, but called on Israel to cease any actions that are contributing to this finding of potential, plausible genocide, that the number of aid trucks and the amount of aid entering has actually fallen dramatically. And you also have now Israel, over the objections of the U.S., targeting some of the people who've been really key in distributing the aid on the ground, in specifically Gaza police officers. Now, they'll say, oh, well, they're Hamas. Yeah, because Hamas was the government. But the U.S. had asked them to stop targeting these civil society workers who are critical for helping to distribute what little aid is getting in, and that has not happened. In fact, if anything, they have stepped up the targeting of those individuals on top of course, the massacres that we've seen, like the Flower Massacre, of directly targeting starving Gazans who are going to try to obtain what aid they can. There was an extraordinary report in the Washington Post, summed up, quite well, I think, by Dave DeCamp of antiwar.com. Great website, by the way, like libertarian or right-leaning anti-war website that I highly recommend to you guys, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen, and I'll read Dave's assessment of the Washington Post report, which really was quite stunning. So this Washington Post report attempted to go back to October 7th and basically look at how the U.S. ended up in the place it is now, and the, at this point, undeniable and manifest failures of the Biden administration's policy, to say nothing about its immorality. So Dave writes, Biden administration officials knew back in October 27th to be specific, that Israel was bombing buildings in Gaza without having solid intelligence that they were military targets, and continued to provide full support for Israeli military operations anyway. So we knew, October 27th, we knew that Israel was indiscriminately bombing without solid intelligence, and yet you remember the language and the rhetoric and the policy support that was levied behind Israel at that point and continues to be to this day. Let me just continue reading this, guys. They say the report said that a briefing took place at the White House on October 27th, 3 weeks into that brutal Israeli military campaign. Due to the sheer destruction in Gaza, it was clear Israel was bombing the strip indiscriminately, and a report that we covered extensively here from Plus 972 magazine, published in November, revealed Israel was actually intentionally hitting civilian targets. Israeli intelligence sources told 972 that Israel targeted what it called power targets, which includes civilian infrastructure, such as high-rise apartment buildings, banks, universities, other public buildings. The sources said the Israeli military would also approve strikes that kill large numbers of civilians in an attempt to target one Hamas member. Biden officials also acknowledged during that October 27th meeting that Israel had no clear plan on how to defeat Hamas. So think about that. They knew that this idea of, well, we're hunting Hamas was bullshit from the early days of this war. Quote, we never had a clear sense that the Israelis had a definable and achievable military objective, a source familiar with the meeting told the Post. Quote, from the very beginning, there's been a sense of us not knowing how the Israelis were going to do what they said they were going to do. U.S. intel has acknowledged since that Hamas is not going away. The annual threat assessment that was released publicly by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that we also covered here on Breaking Points this month said Israel, quote, probably will face lingering armed resistance from Hamas for years to come. Despite the lack of a realistic goal and massive civilian casualties, President Biden still continues to provide unconditional military aid for the slaughter. Since October 7th, his administration has approved over 100 arms deals for Israel. So bottom line, they knew. They knew the hunt for Hamas was bullshit. They knew civilians were being targeted from the very early days, and it did not stop them from shipping 100 different times, 100 weapon sales, voting down, vetoing UN ceasefire resolutions, providing overwhelming diplomatic cover and support and rhetorical support to Israel. And one last thing, Saagar, that was not in that particular report about this Washington Post piece, but that was also very noteworthy with regard to the raid on Al-Shifa, that you'll recall the Biden administration greenlit. And that very day, when they came out and said, oh, we agree with the Israeli intelligence with regard to Al-Shifa, and we think that there is this command and control Hamas node under the hospital, that was the very day that the first raid of Al-Shifa occurred. Well, Senator Chris Van Hollen, in this Washington Post piece, who had received a classified briefing about that U.S. intelligence on Al-Shifa, said, quote, there were important and subtle differences between what Biden officials were saying publicly and what the intelligence actually showed. Quote, I did find there to be some disconnect between the administration's public statements and the classified findings. In other words, the Biden administration lied on behalf of Israel about what our intelligence said about that supposed never-proven Hamas command and control node in order to give Israel the green light to go ahead and raid that hospital. That has led to numerous this point, I couldn't even say how many hospital raids, including we've just had our 4th raid of Al-Shifa that we covered this week as well.
I encourage people to go and read this entire thing. It's very well written. John Hudson, one of the reporters on there, is a very good guy. He covers the State Department, has for a long time. It's a very excellent piece because it outlines exactly why there's so much of a disconnect between public and private outside of the political. The overall strategy that they are now acknowledging is failure is that the bear hug strategy allows you to be close if you back somebody up, and that will then let them listen to you because you're holding them close and you're actually sticking with them, as opposed to if you criticize them from the outset, then they're not going to listen to you from the beginning. But what they demonstrate in the piece is that step by step by step by step is that the bear hug, even with the bear hug, was being taken advantage of by the Israeli side, but was not being listened to. And that in the end, what happened is that Biden himself ends up looking foolish. One of the ways you can really see that right now is Netanyahu just losing it over Schumer. I mean, apparently he's been berating him behind the scenes. Netanyahu actually addressed the Senate Republican conference this morning, which, by the way, John Fetterman asked to sit in on. But
oh my God.
That's a whole other
Jesus
separate conversation. In that meeting, he berated Chuck Schumer and allied himself even more with the Republican Party. And, let's be honest, it's not like Schumer called for anything substantively different.
No.
So my only point is that the bear hug strategy is met with the same contempt at an analytical policy level, brass tacks, as opposed to the same critical level and withholding. The only thing the only thing they really seem to understand is actual strength, which has not yet been tried by any administration, by any real political entity in the U.S.
Not for a while, anyway. Certainly not under this administration. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.